Cuban citizens who are escaping from their country and coming to our shores.
President Carter determined it would set up relocation camps, Fort Chaffee being one of them.
We were being processed. We were given place to stay in the barracks. There were 20,000 Cubans there.
It scares the American people. You can't tell if these people are good or bad or what.
There weren't any fences at first, and a lot of these people, they didn't know why they were there. We came here for freedom. Why are we in this place?
I got a call that morning at 11 o'clock saying they're having trouble at Chaffee, they're rioting.
People in Barling set up barricades across Highway 22 and they had their guns out.
And how would I judge those people who were charged to take care of me?
People that were in danger were the Cubans.
I think they did the best they could under the circumstances. Could they have done it better? Damn right they could have done it better.
In the heartland of Arkansas's River Valley lies one of the world's most historic combat training military camps, Fort Chaffee. I'm Jo Ellison. In 1980, the housing barracks were open to thousands of Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro's communist rule. Some called Fort Chaffee home for 2 years before being able to leave, and Channel 5 was there through it all. It's all documented through video, reporter accounts, and interviews locked up in the KFSM vault. We sorted through it to tell you the story of how a language barrier, cultural differences, and fear of the unknown nearly led to Chaffee's undoing. This was all in a time that is a stark contrast from today. But in the middle of it all is the story of how a small rural community came together to provide a new life for those seeking liberty. This is Chaffee in Crisis.
I'd like to make a statement to you and to the nation. Tens of thousands of Cubans are fleeing the repression of the Castro regime under chaotic and perilous conditions. At least 7 people have died on the high seas. The responsibility for those deaths and the threat of further loss of life rests on the shoulders of Fidel Castro.
In 1980, 3 years into his presidency, Jimmy Carter declared the United States as a country of refugees, promising to welcome fleeing Cubans with open arms.
First, we're ready to start an airlift and a sea lift for these screened and qualified people to come to our country. We will provide this airlift and sea lift to our country and to other countries as well.
Reversing a closed immigration policy, Castro announced on April 20th, 1980, that he would open the port of Mariel. It caused a mass exodus of more than 125,000 Cubans who were escaping starvation and repression to seek a life of liberty in the U.S.
It was chaotic and extremely dangerous. I couldn't say goodbye to my mother, nothing. I just kept going.
Cuban native Felix Erlson was 27 years old the day he boarded a bus that would carry him to freedom.
There was no time to look back.
He was an English teacher in Cuba, walking home when he says Cuban authorities were rounding up people on a bus bound for America. But there were stipulations.
You had to be in prison or an ex-convict, or you had to be a homosexual. To which I replied, I don't fall in any of those categories. So, well, when it was my turn, the policeman that was there told me that my crimes were armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and vagrancy. So we all were giving some type of charges. The regime was making the American people believe that all the scum was coming here, which in actuality, many of us were bad people, but not all of us. They were hurt that people were living in exodus like that after living under the communist regime for so many years. They never expected that to happen. but it happened.
When boats arrived in Cuba, the U.S. didn't have any control over who the regime loaded onto them.
Loading these boats up with people, not knowing who they are, what they are, or anything about them, but they're there to leave and go to the United States. They took them to Key West and other places and just turned them out and then go back for another load. It was a remarkable thing that happened. Some of these old boats were rickety, some of them sank, some people drowned, and now all of a sudden at the Air Force Base, they were overwhelmed. What do we do with all these people? And so President Carter determined that we'll set up relocation camps in old military bases that we had, Fort Chaffee being one of them.
In 1941, a little more than 15,000 acres made up Fort Chaffee, a military base used to train local, state, and federal branches of the U.S. military. Its vast land and barracks nestled in Arkansas's River Valley would make it ideal for thousands of fleeing refugees.
First plane load landed in Fort Smith. No preparation. We had some police and stuff out there with buses to take them from the airport to Chaffee. They had some barracks set up, and we started moving them out there.
I'm Robert Houston. It didn't take long for the list of Governor Clinton's concerns to reach.
I worked in the news department at Channel 5, KFSM, for many years, and during the time that when the relocation operation began until it ended, I was in the news department. As far as public sentiment was concerned, I won't say that the entire community was against it, but I would say that there was a lot of fear-mongering that went on prior to them arriving and certainly after they arrived.
We live over here at the back gate, you know, and it scares the American people, you know, because, you know, you can't tell if these people are good or bad or what.
I don't know, I got kind of mixed feelings. I just don't see why we'd have to, you know, have all of them out here.
We couldn't interview them because they didn't speak English.
You know, everybody spoke English back then. And of course, interpreters were a problem. We didn't have interpreters.
Certainly no one in law enforcement spoke Spanish. And I'm not sure that any of the National Guard personnel or whoever was running the base at that time could speak Spanish. I mean, it was sort of a recipe for disaster.
Well, now you have thousands of Cuban refugees starting to arrive in America at multiple military bases all across the country. The idea was to keep them on the property until they could be processed out. The government wanted to document their personal information before sending them out to start their new lives. They would also need a family member already in the U.S. or a sponsor who would take them on until they could get on their feet. It was hard for many because you had an outside community that wasn't sure they could trust the refugees.
Officials from the League of Latin American Citizens spent most of their morning talking to refugees. Although there were problems in the beginning, the refugees say they're being treated well.
You know, Catholic Charities came to help, you know, relocate people and find families and those types of things for them in various parts of the country. I think some of those folks obviously spoke Spanish. They knew what they were doing. And so I think the authorities relied pretty heavily on those guys because they could at least communicate with them.
Right away, the refugees settled into the barracks and started to build their own communities within its walls.
The food was good because we Cubans were cooking. We demanded that we have Cuban people, Cuban cooks, preparing our meals.
A number of the Cuban refugees at Fort Chaffee practice or participate in voodooism. Refugees like 32-year-old Alcide Ayagramon. He's been a witch doctor for 11 years now. For offerings, Alcide improvises. He uses fruit out of the mess halls, candy, and cookies. Here he showed us how a bad spirit is transferred from someone who has problems to his own body. Alcide says he's eventually able to trick the bad spirits, trap them in a container, and bury them or throw them into the ocean.
Just like in any community, there would be criminal activity that would need to be dealt with.
This is the newly created segregation area the immigration people call Level 2. Refugees who have problems fitting in with some of the others in the general population are brought here. Sunday, when this section opened, almost 100 were rounded up.
The idea of the people in Level 2, it's not a stockade or it's not a jail. It's these people that are having trouble getting along out in the general or the family population. They'll be sent in here for various periods of time.
For the past 2 days, there have been problems here. Monday, one of the refugees set fire to this building. It ruined the entire second floor.
There were fights, stabbings, theft, and other criminal activity among the refugees. They would now have to learn to navigate the American criminal justice system.
Do you think it was hard for the refugees to understand a court system like that?
Oh yeah, they were totally unprepared for it. We're operating in a system of laws here, and the laws apply to everybody. And these poor people were in a system where whatever law was whatever Castro said. We did not have a federal public defender in Arkansas at that time. So they put it out that they're going to interview for this job. Well, this is history being made, and I wanted to be a part of it. So I put in for it, and I was selected. And we had a special courtroom set up in an old barracks building. So I had to take my interpreters, go back into the conference room, talk to each one of the prisoners and get their story, tell them what they're charged with. And I learned culpable or no culpable. Are you guilty or you're not guilty? So we had a court system. They were appointed a lawyer. They were tried before a jury or before the judge if it was a misdemeanor. And it was a system that they had no relation to.
There were other camps across the U.S. like Fort Chaffee that were housing a combined 100,000 Cuban refugees at the time. Still waiting for a sponsor to take them on so they could leave the confinements of the U.S. government, many were successful at starting a new life, though some ended up in prison or deported.
Lenny Torres was charged with first-degree murder today. The 20-year-old Cuban refugee is accused of killing his American sponsor, a 50-year-old woman who volunteered to take Torres from the Fort McCoy Cuban Refugee Center 2 weeks ago. Torres was living in Tomah, Wisconsin, a town of 7,000 people 15 miles from Fort McCoy. 9 other Cuban refugees live here. Residents say they are afraid now.
You hear so many things, maybe some are true and some aren't, but I'm still afraid.
To say I'm glad I'm not sponsoring any of them, let's put it that way.
I just make sure that the doors are all locked when I leave my wife and daughter.
I know I won't leave my wife alone.
At the Fort McCoy Refugee Center, 4,000 Cubans are still waiting for American sponsors. The social service agencies trying to find sponsors for the Cubans admit each time there is an incident, their job gets tougher.
If bad PR comes out, it's very difficult to counteract, whether it's true or not.
The Cuban refugees weren't prisoners, though they were expected to stay on Fort Chaffee grounds until processed out. But after nearly a month, some refugees started to venture out into nearby communities. And this is the turning point. Military police within Chaffee's walls were told by the government not to use violence or force to keep them on the property. Now remember, this was a diplomatic relationship. Then there's state and local agencies on the outside of Fort Chaffee, like Fort Smith Police, the Sebastian County Sheriff's Office, and Arkansas State Police. They didn't have the same orders, but they were sworn to protect their communities.
While federal officials were giving local people the assurance that there would be tightened security here at Fort Chaffee, a number of Cuban refugees walked away from the fort.
Cuban refugees were venturing out into nearby cities like Fort Smith and Barling, causing unrest among people who lived in these communities.
Shortly after noon, at least 5 Cuban refugees left their compound and went over the fence near Gate 5. Guardsmen in riot gear were immediately dispatched to the gate, where they began a sweep of the area to contain any possible further refugee attempts to leave the fort. Outside the post, city police and sheriff's deputies began a search of the residential section bordering the reservation. None of the refugees offered any resistance, although it was apparent at least this one wasn't happy.
Eso que me aprieta aquí, esto que me aprieta, la mierda esta. Ah, me aprieta esto aquí, No soy un caballo ni nada de eso.
Following today's events, those living closest to Gate 5 had strong negative reactions.
Can't patrol 5,000, keep them in. What are they going to do if they get 20 here?
Those tasked with security at Fort Chaffee started tightening their hold, but it was hard to figure out who was in charge and who had the authority to use force if necessary. Then Governor Bill Clinton relayed his conversations with President Carter to Arkansans.
I have received no indication whatever that any of the reservations I have expressed will not be taken into consideration and acted on by the federal officials.
He asked that President Carter make a commitment to him that he, the governor, would have input into the security arrangement.
The president was talking to his aides, it's coming down through the chain of command, and again, nobody was in charge. Nobody was doing anything wrong. They just didn't think they had the authority to do it.
I think a lot of misinformation, there wasn't a lot of transparency in what was coming out of Washington, and I don't know whose fault that was. I don't know if it was the president's fault. I don't know if it was FEMA's or whoever's in charge of it, immigration, naturalization. I don't know. I know the park police, oddly enough, the park police were the ones charged with keeping order at Fort Chaffee, who had no experience and or authority, to my knowledge, of handling a relocation operation with refugees.
As the days ticked by, the number of refugees wanting to leave Fort Chaffee grew significantly. It wasn't long before more law enforcement was called in to help.
On Memorial Day, 1980, Memorial Day is always on Monday, and what happens on Memorial Day in Fort Smith every year? They have the biggest night of the old Fort Days Rodeo, right? Biggest grand entry in the world. Well, that's all going on, and before it let out, all these refugees get out the back gate at Fort Chaffee around Jenny Lind.
And they put out an announcement on the speaker of the rodeo for all sheriff's deputies to report to the office. Something was going on. It was.
So you had this mass exodus of people that you can't talk to, you can't speak to them, you can't understand them. You know, they're going out the back gate at Fort Chaffee to hit Highway 71 down at Jenny Lind. And about that time, the rodeo lets out. So here you got all these people coming from Fort Smith going south on 71 Highway. And Fred McClure, our news director, and myself were at Rye Hill, and we were hanging off the side of that mountain shooting down Highway 71 to get video because they had rounded them up and were trying to herd them up with school buses and cop cars and everything like that. And in the meantime, traffic going south and traffic going north was stalemated. They couldn't go anywhere.
People in surrounding communities were watching it all unfold.
Well, word got out to the public, and people are sitting on their porches with shotguns and pistols and all this kind of stuff. So the fear-mongering thing came into play again. In the meantime, they're trying to round up all these guys and get them back on school buses and get them back to the base. Well, that should have been a big tip-off, I would think, that these people are getting restless, and you better figure something out pretty quick. Well, 6 days later, they rioted.
Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton was demanding more National Guards members and a perimeter be built inside Chaffee's walls. Now, there was also the safety of the refugees at stake and also their freedom. They were growing weary of waiting to be processed out, with a community outside of the walls mindful of their growing tension. The Cuban refugees would hold hunger strikes, chants, protests, and they even advanced guards at the main gate of Fort Chaffee. But it all came to a head on June 1st. A riot broke out. Frustrated that freedom was just out of reach, hundreds of Cuban refugees began to march down Fort Chaffee streets, headed for the front gate. While they were armed military police, reports show force wasn't to be used. The federal government saw this as a diplomatic relocation mission. The crowd of Cuban refugees didn't stop there. They scaled a fence and headed down Highway 22 toward Barling. But Arkansas State Police, on the outside of the military chain of command, did take action against the Cuban refugees, trying to stop them from going any further. They built a human barricade, refusing to let the refugees pass.
Getting through Barling from Fort Smith was almost impossible. I mean, traffic was backed up. There were people standing on the streets. There were crowds of people everywhere.
Robert Houston, a reporter for KFSM Channel 5 at the time, tried making it to the scene.
There was just, you could hear them. You could actually hear what was going on. I mean, there was just a bunch of screaming and hollering. But it was just a zoo. Nobody knew what to do, and it was just a situation that got out of hand really, really quickly.
People in surrounding communities got word and decided to march to Fort Chaffee and stand in defense. They wanted to stop the escaped refugees from entering their towns.
They had the big breakout, they called it. People in Barling set up barricades across Highway 22 and they had their guns out. And now the people that were in danger were the Cubans. But they were frightened of them. Who are they? They're the other. We're always frightened of the other.
Eventually, police were able to calm the angry mob, who, according to reports at the time, wanted to attack the refugees, who they heard had just broken out of Fort Chaffee and were coming into their communities.
This was a situation that was just waiting to have problems. I mean, it was just because it was done so quickly and so rapidly.
It was also reported a few refugees had been shot.
Gunfire rang out, and Cuban refugee Jose Padron lay wounded, shot by a Federal Protection Service officer. Within a matter of seconds, a disturbance erupted. There was rock throwing and shouting, and federal officers went into the crowd swinging billy clubs. For several hours, crowds of angry Cubans roamed the compound, throwing rocks at security officers and overturning cars. Before it was over, 45 people had been injured, 4 seriously. 9 automobiles had been destroyed. Today, officials were still trying to sort out what had happened, but they insisted the shooting that sparked the violence was justified.
The officer used his weapon in defense of the life of another Cuban. The suspect had a homemade knife and was on the downward thrust with it when the officer did discharge his weapon.
I think that it was probably a combination of about 11 months of frustration and not understanding exactly what had happened.
But the trouble may not be over. There was another disturbance this afternoon. Security forces were called out after refugees began throwing rocks to protest the detention of a curfew violator. The crowd was finally dispersed.
It appears that things are fairly calm at the moment. But the blood is still up, you know, and it's still there, and we have to be very, very careful.
Cuban refugee Felix Earlson wasn't a part of the riots. He witnessed it from afar, though he contemplates what may have led up to it.
Residents of the city of Barling, residents of the city of Fort Smith, they didn't know us. They all were on alert. They all were scared because from the beginning they heard that criminals were coming this way. Anyone who hears that will immediately take action, will be armed and guard his or her property. We ate better than we ever ate in Cuba. We slept, and at the beginning we were treated very fairly. But as I said at the beginning of the interview, there were too many people that had come from prison, many people from mental institutions. In other words, different personalities. Everyone that was there was not willing to be there or be willing to be in this country. They were taken forcibly. Force, of course. So that was, I imagine, the only way that they thought was right for them to express their anger and their disappointment.
The Cuban refugees were stuck between two worlds, a communist-led life in Cuba and now firmly standing on the land of the free.
We did not do that in Cuba because it was different there.
How?
Well, the regime would have suffocated that upheaval. Yes, that was not allowed in Cuba at all. Oh no.
Were you surprised that it would happen here?
Yes, I was very surprised. Yes, yes.
The worst of the riot was still to come.
There was smoke coming up from the grounds out here.
Some of the refugees who were a part of the riot set fire to a few of the housing barracks.
You know, state police guys were coming in from, you know, as far away as, I think they came as far away as Mena and Russellville and places like, because they had to have reinforcements.
Those on the base were able to put out the fires and eventually calm the crowd.
Late this afternoon, Camp Director Barbara Lawson spoke to the 2,700 refugees on a closed-circuit radio broadcast to try and restore peace and emphasized that further violence would only slow the already difficult task of finding sponsors.
Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton and the White House aide President Carter sent to Fort Chaffee to lead the refugee relocation, Gene Eidenberg, were on the ground that night. They had a full schedule. It was time to answer questions from local leaders. They wanted to know what kind of security would be put in place from here, and their schedules were full.
Again tomorrow, Eidenberg will meet with local officials to tell them what the federal government has planned for Fort Chaffee. From what we've been able to piece together, Eidenberg's schedule looks like this. At 10, a meeting with local mayors, representatives from Arkansas's congressional delegation, and law enforcement officials. And an hour and a half later, a meeting with the press.
From this riot, the federal government, the state of Arkansas, and those on the ground at Chaffee could see that more security was needed. Up until this point, the refugees were free. But now the walls start closing in on them. Fences went up, more law enforcement was brought in, and there was word that more refugees were coming to Fort Chaffee.
June 1st, Arkansas State Police took a beating. They were the ones who stopped hundreds of angry Cuban refugees from getting off Fort Chaffee property. They were, at the time, ill-equipped, but no more.
Military police were issued shields, riot gear, and tear gas. They were prepared for any future riots.
As unrest heightens at Fort Chaffee, so does security. After rioting on the 1st of June, the Federal Emergency Management Agency began installing fencing around the refugee living area. 43-year-old George Hernandez says the refugees are impatient and dissatisfied with the American government and the volunteer agencies working to resettle the Cubans, but they praise American citizens for their generosity and compassion.
The government, very bad.
The American government?
Yeah.
Freedoms of living their everyday life without interference started to change for the refugees. KFSM reporter Robert Houston remembers seeing military police perform a sweep of the refugees' living quarters.
They pulled out, you know, machetes and clubs and, you know, handmade knives and shivs and all this kind of stuff like that.
Security was also the top discussion among state leaders, like then Governor Bill Clinton.
The governor is seeking clarification of several items in the plan. Among those are ensuring that the military forces have authority over the Cubans all the way to the main gate and not just inside the compound. And he wants clarification of the role civilian forces would play should Cubans escape beyond the main gate. Clinton is also demanding that a head count of the refugees be taken on a regular basis to ensure there are no Cubans unaccounted for.
Law enforcement on the local level tightened security as well and put plans in place to protect their communities.
Reacting with good common sense, Sheriff Cothran says, is what got police through the turbulence at Fort Chaffee in May and June. But now he knows reacting to a bad situation isn't good enough, so he's devised a security plan to protect everyone involved. Specifically, it involves better communication. There now is a direct hotline from Fort Chaffee to the sheriff's dispatcher. All local police units now have Fort Chaffee on their frequencies, so if and when trouble begins, officials will know what to expect. Lastly, Cothran has hired 4 extra men to provide round-the-clock protection. Usually, the sheriff's deputies go off duty at midnight, but now there will be security guards 24 hours a day patrolling the area around Fort Chaffee. The sheriff says he's confident the plan will work if there are any problems, and he says he does expect problems.
As to the magnitude of those problems, I can't answer. I can't conceive getting that many people together, that many people that are predisposed to cause trouble without some problems erupting. I am more confident now than I was in May and June that the authorities will be able to contain it on Fort Chaffee. I'm not insensitive to their problems out at Fort Chaffee, but my main concern is towards the citizens of Sebastian County, and I just hope that they can contain it on Fort Chaffee out there if it does erupt.
While officials at Fort Chaffee and beyond its walls kept their attention focused on new security measures, those within the community had their eyes on a trial that was sparked from the riots.
Several INS agents ended up being charged with mistreating the prisoners, the refugees.
After testimony ended yesterday in the trial of 5 former Fort Chaffee guards accused of beating and abusing Cuban refugees, a day that included the testimony of 2 of the defendants, today both the prosecution and the defense presented closing arguments in the case. Defense attorney Charles Carr, representing former security supervisor Curtis Clark, told the 5-man, 7-woman jury today that problems arising from security at the relocation center were, in his words, the result of a bureaucratic bungle. Defense attorney Eddie Christian, agreeing with Carr, added, Clark and the 4 INS guards were thrown into a volatile and confused situation, told to maintain order among the Cubans, but were not told specifically how to do so.
When Level 2 was brought into existence, at the beginning there was no control. Okay, they just went. They were wild. Like I testified, we had one of the refugees climb up a tree and start urinating all over the offices. You know, it's we can't let something like that happen. You know, so we just took control of the situation. We did what we had to do.
Christian did not deny that some, quote, tail-kicking took place, but said the guards were merely trying to discipline the Cubans and that medical evidence was not presented that would indicate actual instances of abuse took place. As he indicated he would, Judge Warren Harris sequestered the jury until a verdict is reached in the case. Harris told the jury to take as long as it wanted this evening and to continue until tomorrow if necessary. Reporting for the News People, I'm Rusty Mizell.
The judge declared a mistrial on the 14 remaining issues about which the jury reported that it was deadlocked. And although the officers may be retried on those counts, attorneys for the defense and the government would not comment extensively about that possibility.
Charlie, what are your thoughts about?
The riots also grabbed the attention of Washington, who promised to back up law enforcement's security plans.
For an hour this morning, White House aide Gene Eidenberg met with local officials. He answered their questions about Fort Chaffee. He promised them reimbursement for expenses, perhaps help with water problems and airport damage. And he promised them this time around security and an organized operation.
Up to this point, Washington, D.C. leaders told the Fort Smith and Barling communities there would be no more Cuban refugees coming to Fort Chaffee.
All of these measures have given Fort Chaffee a look of permanency as a refugee resettlement center. Despite that, base officials have said there are no plans to use the base for other groups of refugees.
A promise they took back, and White House officials had to answer for it during press conferences. More Cuban refugees were on their way from the other U.S. bases.
As one of the officials put it, Eidenberg is one heck of a public relations man. He was here today to explain why the White House chose Fort Chaffee as a permanent resettlement center, despite an earlier promise that no more Cubans would be sent here.
I am painfully mindful of the fact that I made a commitment to this community, to its senators, to its congressmen, to Governor Clinton, and to the local officials here in this area, when I visited this fort on June 1st, that no additional Cubans would be brought to Fort Chaffee. I must take personal responsibility for the necessity of now extending the use of Fort Chaffee for a number of months and for bringing Cubans who are now currently housed at the 3 other locations to Fort Chaffee for consolidation purposes.
Eidenberg said there was no alternative. Chaffee is located in a warm climate. It is winterized. It is an inactive military base. He said accusations that the decision was a political one were absurd.
However, the decision did have political impacts.
It had immense implications. Bill Clinton was governor.
And I must say a special word about Fort Chaffee.
Jimmy Carter was president. The president decided to use the federal base, totally in his control. Clinton had nothing to say about it, but he gets blamed. And Carter gets blamed. Of course, we had a lot of things going on. We had the Iran hostage crisis going on right then. We had the Cuban thing going on right then. 1980 was an election year.
I love the people of this nation.
Governor Clinton is running for re-election, and he knows another day like June 1st could be devastating to a political career.
Someone has asked me a few moments ago if I felt that this would be damaging to the president's re-election hopes in the state of Arkansas, and I said, you're being kind. I think damaging is too soft. I think that this is going to be devastating.
And both Clinton and Carter were defeated.
I've not achieved all I set out to do. Perhaps no one ever does. But we have faced the tough issues. We've stood for and we fought for and we have achieved some very important goals for our country. These efforts will not end with this administration.
In Arkansas, a guy named Frank White ran against Clinton.
I have made a personal commitment that I'm going to travel the state of Arkansas for the next 6 or 7 months and listen to people and find out what's on their mind and their concerns.
And Clinton had raised the price of car tags to go toward highway construction. And it was Cubans and car tags was the campaign against him.
It's obvious Frank White doesn't think Bill Clinton is the best business manager the state of Arkansas has ever had. At every opportunity, he brings up license fees and title transfer fees raised under the current state administration.
My criticism during the campaign, let's be very specific about my criticism. Why? Because I said that they had made promises to the people of Arkansas and hadn't kept them. And what were those promises? They were going to screen the refugees, and they didn't. The military were going to be allowed to use force on the night of the riot, and they didn't. And then we weren't going to get any more Cuban refugees, and we got them all.
Now, he came back in 2 years and was reelected. It was very positive. He ran a great campaign, and he's a master politician.
Since my defeat in the last election, I've practiced law and spent more time with my wife and daughter. I've also traveled our state talking with hundreds of you about what I did right and wrong as governor. And I'll have to admit, sometimes I did lose the forest for the trees. For example, you've criticized me for raising the car license and title transfer fees, but it was a mistake because so many of you were hurt by it, and I'm really sorry for that.
He was reelected and defeated Frank White. He was talking about going into the future and what we need to do for the state, which is what a smart politician does. Don't dwell on the past. He was reelected, and the rest is history.
With the riots behind them, the Cuban refugees, law enforcement, and those within the surrounding communities started to settle in. They'd be there for a while. The season started to change, and some refugees at Fort Chaffee were there far longer than anyone could have imagined. Some of their stories are heartbreaking as they continue their search for a new life and liberty.
As with many aspects of the refugee center, security at Fort Chaffee has undergone a type of evolution. Policy often adapts to unexpected security problems. Guards at entrances to the refugee living area check civilian traffic to control who and what goes into the compound. Base officials have suspected that drugs and other contraband have entered the base by way of civilian workers. Other than meals, English classes, and recreational activities, there are few constructive diversions for the approximate 4,700 Cubans now at the base. And officials fear that idleness may have a significant adverse effect on the temperament and behavior of the Cubans. Gunther Wagner, Director of Operations within the refugee living area, has worked for the U.S. government in several Latin American countries. He says the frequency of violence at Fort Chaffee is in part due to the hot-blooded nature of the Cubans. But he also said there is a direct relationship between the refugees' length of stay and their level of frustration.
They do not feel or they wish that they could go out and fend for themselves. They don't want to be fed 3 meals a day and giving a roof over their heads. And they feel that they should go out, they should be given the opportunity to go out and work and set up a new life. And as time goes on, as time progresses, and we can't come up with sufficient sponsors, these people become more frustrated. That goes without saying.
Cuban refugee Felix Earlson had spent 3 months at Fort Chaffee when he met a woman that could help him with his sponsorship.
I used to work at a mess hall inside the camp. Norma Jean Springs would go there with her mother and another woman. So I used to work at the mess hall, of course, and then I used to serve them food. And then we started the relationship like that.
The opportunity to move beyond Chaffee's walls and start living a life of liberty almost slipped through his fingers. The riots had sparked unrest among the guards, and as security tightened, so did the tension. Felix says one day there was a commotion among some other Cuban refugees.
I was being curious, and I went outside. The police arrived, and so happened that the policeman asked me what was happening. I said, I don't know what is happening. I was on my way to take a shower. And then he said, I want your friends. And I said, listen, I don't have any friends here. Well, I want you. And he arrested me. He took me to jail inside the camp.
Felix says it was a wrongful arrest, with police still on edge and Cuban refugees who were still upset with the prolonged stay at Fort Chaffee.
I used to smoke back then. I was wearing a cap, and I had a pack of cigarettes hidden underneath it. A Cuban man was arrested for some reason. I don't know. I didn't know him. He asked for cigarettes. I shared mine with him. Later, I was taken to, some days later, I was taken to the courthouse here in Fort Smith, and the man was there, and he was with another Cuban man, but they were rolling their eyes at me. And I was wondering, I don't know either one of them. Well, at least I know this one with whom I share my cigarettes. Well, they were accusing me of having stabbed one of them with a butcher's knife. And I thank God that I knew the English language and I defended myself. So I asked the judge to tell the man to lift his shirt so he could show his scar. It was nothing, just like a vaccination, like a vaccine puncture. And the judge dismissed the charges. I was taken back to Fort Chaffee, and I had the opportunity to speak to the woman who was in the process of sponsoring me. And I contacted her, Norma Jean Springs, from Fort Chaffee, Oklahoma. She's deceased now. And she asked me if I still wanted her to sponsor me. I said, yes, of course. I did not do anything, which was true.
For others, like Cuban refugee Rosa Rosas, it took longer to find a sponsor. She spent a total of 8 months at Fort Chaffee. From the minute she stepped onto U.S. soil, it was hard for her. Harder, she says, than growing up in a poverty-stricken Cuba and leaving her family for a life in the U.S. at just 16 years old.
Caí de ahí de Cayo Hueso, me tocó la base naval de Pensilvania. En Pensilvania me reclutaron en sí para una escuela, no para un jack-up. a los 16 allí. No quise estar en el Yaca porque me había encontrado novio y fue cuando salí embarazada.
From Cuba to a base in Pennsylvania and attending school, Rosa met a young man and got pregnant. She says she didn't want to be in school. Her resistance was seen as rebellion, and she was transferred to a mental hospital.
Ahí me pusieron muchos medicamentos, lo que me recuerdo ahora, muchos medicamentos.
While heavily medicated, Rosa says a riot broke out on October 20th, 1980 at the St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington.
Tirando cosas, quemando adentro y todo. Yo solo recuerdo que me salí por abajo de una cerca y el SWAT.
Rosa escaped through the bottom of a fence, and law enforcement took her to a prison in Lexington, Kentucky to be evaluated.
Ahí me dio la depresión más fuerte.
Eventually, Rosa was reunited with the father of her unborn baby, who was inside the walls of Fort Chaffee.
Yo estaba en el área de familia. En el área de familia donde había más mujeres embarazadas, matrimonios. Y ahí sí me trataban bien.
But not every aspect in her life was going well. Now, at 9 months pregnant, Rosa says she was suffering from domestic abuse.
Una nube negra me vino peleando con el padre de mi hija. ¿Sabe? Cuando uno lo maltrata, ¿no? Él me estaba pegando, no tuvo solución, tenía miedo y la opción mía fue tirarme por la ventana.
She fell 2 stories and was rushed to a hospital. She had a broken leg, and they had to do emergency surgery to save her baby.
A Dios gracias, a la niña no le pasó nada.
The lives of the Cuban refugees were changing.
As the refugee population declines, so does the number of workers needed to take care of the Cubans. At its peak, Fort Chaffee manned 22 self-contained mess halls, giving jobs to over 800 local workers. But for the past few months, mess halls on the base have been closing at an accelerated rate.
No more riots broke out, and as time wore on, the Cuban refugees were able to start new lives. Empty barracks were left behind, some in need of repair.
In addition to what the federal government has already spent relocating Cuban refugees, it must now spend another $7.9 million repairing the base that housed a large portion of those refugees. All but 104 of the military barracks at Fort Chaffee have been turned back over to the Army.
Felix never left Fort Smith. It's still his home today.
There was another woman whom I met in 1981, Mrs. Yuba Harris Winton. She used to be the head of the Black Community Program, and she was the one who invited me to church. And she also was the one who got the job for me at Ream Manufacturing Company. I worked there for 37 years and 8 months.
Today, he's retired. He plays in his church's band. Rosa lives in California today. She has 3 children and 9 grandchildren. The daughter she had while at Fort Chaffee is now in her 40s with children of her own. 125,000 Cubans escaped the communist rule of Cuba and made their way to the U.S. under then-President Carter's leadership. More than 25,000 of those Cuban refugees came through Fort Chaffee's base. For many, Fort Chaffee was their home for quite a while. The operation to house them and get them sponsors in total took 2 years. By the end, Cuban refugees were leaving in groups, and soon that last bus pulled away. Cleanup began, and history was already made.
They're not your average-looking group of jet-setters, but this small group of Cuban refugees who left the Fort Smith airport early this morning will be in California before nightfall. These 10 refugees are part of a recently approved sponsorship program in California. CRT, a job training organization there, plans to sponsor 10 Cubans each week for the next 10 weeks.
In 1982, Ronald Reagan was now president.
And I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day.
Frank White was governor of Arkansas.
My victory on November 4th was a victory of conservative philosophy.
A very different leadership than the Carter-Clinton era.
A 4:30 start this morning was necessary to board the Cubans on flights from Fort Smith Municipal Airport. The destinations of the 72 were as diverse as their background.
Once the federal government started moving refugees from Fort Chaffee in groups, the population dwindled quickly.
Some were going to individual sponsors as near as Fort Smith, while others were bound for halfway houses as distant as New York. The refugees began boarding shortly after sunrise. Their flights were destined for St. Louis, Dallas, and Denver, with numerous stops and connections in other cities.
Coming from the rule of a communist regime, the Cuban refugees' first independent footsteps into the land of the free would be very different than anything they'd experienced.
A bilingual Chaffee worker offered advice about life in America. He explained their legal status and how their behavior would affect the likelihood of their becoming citizens. He told them that this is a country whose chief executive officer recently was replaced without bloodshed, and that its citizens are entrusted with determining such peaceful changes.
The last few refugees to leave Fort Chaffee were harder to place.
The remaining refugees are said to have special physical or psychological needs. And tomorrow, local officials should learn how the federal government plans to attend to those needs.
The 22 boarded a bus to Tulsa, where they left by air for Chicago. And unless additional delays develop, in a few weeks they'll leave that detention center also, perhaps never to return to razor wire and fences in the land of the free.
After 2 years, it was over. All Cuban refugees were onto their new lives, and now there was a lot of cleanup to do. It would become quite costly.
Now, Major Richard Brown, with the aid of 150 civilian workers, slowly began the task of putting the base back in order. Restoration on the barracks began 1 year ago, and so far only 228 buildings have been finished. Brown and his crew now have 514 barracks left to restore, with the majority of those buildings being in even worse shape.
A lot was packed into those 2 years for Cuban refugees. They escaped a life of communism, only to end up behind a fence that kept them from freedom. The goal was to get them there, but merging two cultures wasn't easy. One trying to teach the ways of America, the other trying to learn it. For some it came easy, others had a harder time. So much was at stake: freedom, a new life. Former KFSM reporter Robert Houston, who was there from the beginning, says it was a learning experience for everyone.
Just imagine what it would be like if that happened to us. That's the thing that always revert back to that. What would I do? How would I react if I was in the same situation those poor people were in? And how would I judge those people who were charged to take care of me? I think they did the best they could under the circumstances. Could they have done it better? Damn right they could have done it better.
Today, there aren't many stories out there about the Cuban Relocation Project and Fort Chaffee's role in housing those seeking freedom. But Jim Spears made sure his memories of that time are out there for the world to read. He wrote a book about his time at Fort Chaffee, Yearning to Breathe. It's full of stories from his time as a lawyer and defender.
Now it's a political hot potato that probably will never happen again. And nobody in the federal government really took responsibility for anything. The military said, this is a civilian matter. We don't have jurisdiction. And they had maybe 2 deputy U.S. Marshals out there at the time for 25,000 people. And some of these people they had mental illness, they had disease, they were pulled out of the prisons, mental institutions, off the street, and hurried onto boats. Castro thought he was going to be pulling a real big one on the United States, But actually it turned out that we pulled a good one on him because we handled it.
Today, there are very few reminders at Fort Chaffee that the Cuban relocation project ever happened. But if you look hard enough, it's there. Like this small building that was used as a prison guard shack during the relocation. There's a mural now painted on the back of it by artist Brian Alexis. It tells the stories of not only the Cuban refugees, but also the thousands of soldiers, evacuees, and workers who came through and were once a part of Fort Chaffee and its vast history.
I wanted this mural to be about the people, of course, and not just something that came out of my head, but I wanted to do more like portraits of actual people who lived and worked out here.
He found yearbooks in the Fort Chaffee Museum archives and photos from each major event that happened on the land. He brought them to life with a splash of color, starting with the soldiers that have trained at Fort Chaffee.
And if you look at the mural, those are the bookends. We have a recruit that is entering the base. We have someone that was on bivouac. In other words, they were in the midst of being trained. I kind of like to imagine they were like riding home. And then a soldier that is leaving as a fully trained soldier onto wherever his life was taking him next. And then of course this small boy, this Cuban refugee, again thinking about placing yourself in his shoes. What was he doing? What was he thinking? What kind of experience was this? And you know, how do they feel about those experiences now? Right in the center, I wanted to highlight one of the Vietnamese refugees who was here. She had such a haunting look, and again, you know, this is a person that is in transition, you know, and in a very traumatic time in their lives. And so I wanted to pay homage to that experience.
In 1975, Fort Chaffee housed close to 26,000 Vietnamese refugees fleeing a falling Saigon. It was the first refugee relocation to ever take place at Fort Chaffee. Former 5 News reporter Jay Plyburn filed this report when a refugee returned 44 years later to see the place she sought refuge.
Hui Tran Berger was 6 years old when she and her family arrived at Fort Chaffee just 2 days after the fall of Saigon.
We escaped the city right before, pretty much as it fell.
Hui says she'll never forget that first day on American soil, a day that city officials had been preparing for.
It was a cool, cloudy, rainy day. It was drizzling a little bit. One of the memories that I remember, of course, is the welcoming the people on the side of the road, waving the American flag, lots of people, and it was just a very warm welcome. This is what I remember, the beds. That's exactly it. We had bunk beds in ours, so it would be closer to this one.
She says it was the first bed she was able to call her own.
Some stayed 7 months before the operation wrapped up. The Vietnamese relocation was an important time in Fort Chaffee's history. It would set the tone to show how useful the base could be to those seeking refuge. Of course, 5 years later, Cuban refugees would seek refuge at Fort Chaffee. And in August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall in the city of New Orleans. Levees broke, most of the city was flooded, and around 400,000 people no longer had a home. Fort Chaffee was set up as an intake center to help people get back on their feet.
Another GI to become acquainted with those interminable Army lineups.
Fort Chaffee was even the place where the haircut herd around the world happened.
To military uniformity.
Elvis Presley was drafted into the Army, where he'd sport a buzz cut. His famous locks, dubbed so by fans, one who wrote to President Eisenhower at the time to stop the haircut, fell to the floor of this Fort Chaffee barbershop. While While rich in history, Fort Chaffee is also rich in community. Though there were some language barriers, at times cultural differences, in a time period that put barriers between races, people and communities surrounding Fort Chaffee have always stepped up to help a neighbor in need. Those who were there at some of history's toughest times know that to be true.
This is a great nation. There are all sorts of problems. There is no country in the world without problems. But this is one of the greatest nations in the world. How do I know? I'm living proof of that. My origin, the color of my skin, the place from which I came. And I have never encountered major obstacles.
We as Americans have a special responsibility to people who are trying to get a better life and to improve themselves and to become free, yearning to be free. And I think we make a mistake when we get away from that.
Para los jóvenes o todos los que vengan, que aprovechen el tiempo, que estudien principalmente el inglés y que no se metan en problemas para que sigan adelante, para que tengan un futuro bonito y le puedan decir a sus hijos, a sus nietos.
One thing that came out today, Chief Oliver with Fort Smith here mentioned that he would like to set up a program of teaching Spanish to some of his officers.
But I just think people here should feel proud of the fact that we did that we helped people in a bad situation.
That's the story of Chaffee in crisis. We dug deep here in the 5 News archives to find those videos and interviews from 44 years ago. We hope the stories from that time will give you a better understanding of an important historical event that unfolded right here in our own backyard. Today, Fort Chaffee is utilized by all components of the Department of Defense from state, local, and federal levels. Chaffee land is extremely useful to our U.S. military in their quest to train soldiers. And it has been proven time and time again. It's so much more. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jo Ellison.